Starting out as a Nintendo Switch exclusive, Monster Hunter Rise released in 2021 with a fresh take on the Monster Hunter formula, one built on the RE engine, a technology shared with Capcom's other more recent efforts with Resident Evil 7, 8 and Devil May Cry 5. It brought a new hub area, a bigger focus on vertical exploration, and all of it ran at a solid 30 frames per second on Switch at 756p. Yes, there were limits on Switch, like the enemy animations cutting the frame rate at a distance. A PC version in 2022, a year later, fixed that and offered ways to enhance the game further at higher frame rates, resolutions and more, but overall, Capcom's work in Rise really made stellar use of Nintendo's hardware in the first place. It's a game that felt tightly tailored to its mobile technology, and in the context of Monster Hunter Rise's release on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S this year, now 2 years on from that Switch version, that's crucial to bear in mind. The headline: Monster Hunter Rise on console offers practically all the core graphics options available to PC users. Whether you're playing on the last-gen PS4 or Xbox One, or newer PS5 and Series X hardware, you get a very customizable suite of options. There's so much flexibility here in this advanced menu. You get toggles for texture quality, texture filtering, shadows, ambient occlusion, foliage, plus there's these post-processing options right at the bottom. It gives players all the power to decide just how they want Rise to run. Now, given the huge range of options, today I'm focusing just on the PS5, Series X and S versions, in particular because these newer machines offer 120fps support, not available on last gen, and also, in the case of PS5 and Series X, there's an ability to boost the resolution to beyond 4K. More on that in a second. So just how does the frame rate hold up at 60fps on each? And does the 120fps mode run well overall on all three machines? And lastly, how significant is the visual upgrade over Switch? Let's find out. Let's dig into the mode selection first. To make all of these options approachable, Capcom includes 3 global presets before entering the advanced menu. One to prioritize frame rate, one labeled default, and one to prioritize graphics. Also, it's worth saying if you're playing on a 60Hz display, all 3 of these modes target 60fps regardless, and if you have your console set to 120Hz, then absolutely, all 3 simply run uncapped at 120fps, though with varying levels of success as we'll get to later. Either way, the hard work optimizing is done for you really. Each mode has a specific use case. So, on PS5 for example, though all of this applies exactly to Series X, frame rate mode switches all settings off or reduces them to low. The benefit? Well, the frame rate mode is intended for a locked 120fps experience, though, to be honest, it drops settings pretty excessively, and I'd recommend jumping into the advanced section to at least boost the texture quality. Left as is, the prioritized frame rate mode is bare bones, but a pretty good starting point if you want to target 120fps. The lack of ambient occlusion creates a flat, depthless world, there's no swaying foliage, and textures are glaringly low resolution. Image quality also suffers. You'll have noticed in the menus that the image quality value is reduced to 70%. Obviously, 70% is kind of an arbitrary number without knowing the actual target resolution, which we don't have the power to directly tweak on console. It could be anything. So, based on pixel counting, the effective native resolution in the frame rate mode is 2016 by 1134. There's no dynamic resolution here as far as I can see, and so 1134p is what we get. And if we reverse engineer that number back to 100%, the set resolution originally would logically come out at 2880 by 1620. The frame rate mode then has a purpose, giving us our absolute failsafe mode for hitting 120fps, but again, it's quite a visual hit on all fronts. Next up, there's the default mode. This is much more like what we'd expect on PS5 or Series X, though ideally you're aiming for a 60fps experience for this one. On default, the target resolution is pushed to a true 4K, And at 100% image scale, you do actually get 3840 by 2160, creating a much crisper image. Default also enables options for high-res textures, ambient occlusion, and swaying foliage, adding far more depth and movement to the scene. The shadow quality option also gets pushed to average, while texture filtering bumps up to high, so all round, we're getting almost everything maxed out here except the shadow setting. So for hitting 60 FPS, this really is the one. All of which brings us to the final mode on the right here, called Prioritize Graphics. This mode is a bit of an extra for visual purists and doesn't totally always lock at 60 FPS. The main point is it boosts the resolution to 125% scale, which is a real surprise. The target res is still 4K here, but at 125% the game is super sampled down from a 4800 by 2700 image. Or to phrase it another way, it's rendering at 4.8K, adding a form of anti-aliasing by scaling a higher res image down to 4K. Monster Hunter Rise's graphics mode gives us the deluxe treatment on PS5 and Series X, and to be clear, all this does apply on Series X as well. There really aren't many games out there rendering at beyond 4K either, so it's really one to savour. Looking back, we have cases like The Tourist rendering at 8K on PS5, and then also we have Ori and the Will of the Wisps running at 6K on Series X. In Monster Hunter Rise's case, the 4.8K super sampling cleans up the image, but honestly, the regular 4K image on default mode already looks superb. It's also worth noting that regardless of which mode you choose, PS5 and Series X use the same draw distance settings for geometry. The screen space reflections are also included on all three modes, though their quality is tied to the native resolution, so that changes, but between the two consoles they're identical. Meanwhile, enemy animations also update at a fluid frame rate regardless of distance, unlike the Switch version, even on the frame rate mode. Plus, all three have an optional dynamic shadow toggle, which for the purposes of most comparisons here is just left enabled. A three-way comparison between each mode speaks for itself, and looking to the far right side on the graphics mode, the fact that PS5 and Series X each pushed to 4.8K is a pretty straightforward translation of their GPU power, and it really works. All of this applies on the Xbox Series S version as well. The settings are exactly the same as the PS5 and Series X in using each mode, from textures to shadows to foliage, the only difference on Series S being that there's a different set of resolution targets. So for the frame rate mode on the left here, the target is 1080p, but with the image quality set at 70%, the true native resolution is in fact 1344 by 756. Next along is the default mode, getting us to 100% of 1440p, and then, curiously, I found the graphics mode here on the right also seems to push a practically native 1440p image. Now, the natural assumption is that the graphics mode on Series S should be pushing a higher native resolution, but in practice, the pixel structure isn't visibly different. A bit of a mystery then, and potentially the graphics mode is running at a higher value. Hitting together PS5, Series X, and S all on their maxed out graphics modes, it's inevitably the exact same image outside of resolution. Cross-platform comparisons like this are a little bit of a moot point really, given we know exactly what settings we're using on each after all. So perhaps more revealing then is how Nintendo Switch slots in. Monster Hunter Rise is a Switch game at its core after all, and to be blunt, even the PS5 version, in example here, doesn't too radically overhaul its visuals. More so, what we end up getting here is better described as neat extras. Texture mapping on skin, materials across the shrines, and shadow resolution are boosted on PS5's Max Graphics preset. We also get dynamic shadows from trees above, which isn't enabled on the Switch release, plus, of course, the resolution upgrade from 756p on Switch to a whopping 4.8K on PS5 is also clearly huge. But still, I think you'll agree the Switch release looks superb for its intended spec, running at 30 FPS and on a smaller screen. Put it down to its artistic direction, but I don't exactly feel shortchanged by what Capcom's achieved on what's fundamentally a handheld system. What the PS5 and Series X versions of Rise do offer is a smoother, crisper big screen experience, whether that's at 60 FPS or even 120 FPS. Next up, let's look at performance. There's no 30 FPS mode here, I'll say that right away. All three modes target 60 FPS on a 60Hz display as you'd expect, or 120 FPS if you've a 120Hz display connected, but that doesn't always mean they'll actually hit those targets. The trade-off in how you use the modes and the many settings is up to you. So if you want 125% image quality or high shadows for example, you're not guaranteed to lock at 60 FPS on PS5 or Series X. How smoothly the game runs or which visual features you want is put entirely in your hands, much like on a PC. So with that in mind, let's start from the ground up, focusing on 60 FPS first. With PS5, Series X and S, frankly speaking, there's very little chance Ryze's ever dropping under 60 FPS with the bare bones frame rate mode selected. It's just so heavily cut back at its visuals. This mode is built with 120 FPS in mind and really overkill for the task of 60 FPS. But what about that middle default mode? Well, default is Capcom's suggested sweet spot, a preset clearly built for locked 4K and 60 FPS gameplay with most visual features intact. As far as PS5, Xbox Series X and S go, the default mode is the best starting point for 60 FPS. Exploring the hub area, the Shrine Ruins, the Frost Islands, it barely skips a beat on our PS5 here. Admittedly, there's ways to stretch the RE engine by playing further into the game or adding more ally hunters in co-op, but the outlook is pretty promising. PS5 nails it across the board for solo play at least, and likewise for Series X. It's a fluid experience all the way through at default. Again though, it goes back to the Switch origin of the game design, a world framework built for a far less powerful system. So bumping the resolution to 4K doesn't have an impact at all on either premium machine, and I'm glad to say Series S follows suit too with a fluid 60 FPS on its default mode, rendering there at 1440p. Even adding dynamic shadows doesn't affect playability at all here, so in terms of 60 FPS, mission accomplished on all fronts. Pushing the boat out, we of course have the graphics mode running at 4.8K on PS5 and Series X, and it's here we see the consoles losing their grip on a tight 60 FPS. In general, graphics mode hits the mark. In fact, PS5 especially holds up best with the tightest lock on all three consoles, the only exception being when the screen view overlaps with transparent elements. Grass or healing effects during boss fights will slip the reading into the 50s, but it's never really aggressive. Couple this with a VRR supporting display and those sub 60 FPS drops will be pretty hard to catch. So if you want to keep all the eye candy, the high shadows, the 4.8K resolution, PS5 is certainly viable based on the first few missions. But as ever, later missions, more complex co-op action, might end up pushing the frame rate harder. And in that case, the default mode is a solid backup option which honestly still pushes a pretty great image. All of which brings us to the Xbox consoles using the graphics mode. Unfortunately, Series X doesn't run quite as fluidly at 60 FPS as PS5 using the same preset. In fact, the boost to 4.8K has entire sections of the Shrine Ruins, for example, run around the mid-50s. Even with no combat and just traversal, there's issues, only escalating when faced with bosses like the Great Izuchi. It's a strange turnout. The solution? Well, one approach is to drop back to the default mode, and there you get a 60 FPS lock back on Series X. But then, on the other hand, VRR supporting displays should be able to work with this 50 to 60 FPS window. It's not ideal, but certainly a step back from PS5 using the same settings, and switching over to the Series S version, running on its own graphics mode, the boosted settings there give even lower results, between 40 to 60 FPS. Not ideal again, and for Series S, the default mode is absolutely the way to go here for a tight 60 FPS lock. "120Hz gameplay is the next big challenge, and I've got to say it, that frame rate mode for all its nips and tucks and the low resolution just hits the spot. On PS5 at least, it's absolutely watertight, rock solid, whichever word you prefer to use. It is 120 FPS without much evidence of a drop. I'd encourage you though to try boosting the settings higher, again for the texture setting, and even bumping the shadow setting to medium too. There's enough GPU headroom on PS5 I've found, at least to make it run without too much of a performance penalty. Moving over to Xbox Series X meanwhile, we see once more the game falling a little shy of PS5's framerate level. Even with the lowest settings possible in these menus and running at an equivalent 1134p resolution to PS5, we're slipping down to around 115 FPS in the shrine area. I will say though, typically Series X is still at that top 120 FPS mark though, around later stages and the hub, but it does suggest a little less GPU headroom to play with if say you want to add more visual features. Interestingly, the Series S version also offers 120Hz support and runs at a similar rate to Series X, even if the resolution is dropped to 756p in the framerate mode. Expect between 110 and 120 FPS on Series S, which is still very acceptable. All of this, of course, is 120 FPS using the framerate mode. But what if? What if we start pushing the settings higher, even walking around the hub area on PS5 and switching to say the default preset immediately shows a drop, and then an even more sizable one when pushing to the graphics mode, which essentially overloads the system. What this essentially gives us in Monster Hunter Rise is a PC benchmark for consoles, a way to genuinely test the RE engine's performance on PS5, Xbox Series X and S up against a 120 FPS target with no real chance of hitting it. We see the middle ground numbers, the peaks and troughs in frame rate as we turn each corner. The obvious comparison point is between PS5 and Series X, again on the graphics mode, the exact same settings, resolution, and it's hard to ignore the PS5 advantage. The margin goes up to around 7 or 8 FPS in PS5's favour at times, a bit of a surprise given the on-paper teraflop advantage on Series X. Still, the results in Monster Hunter Rise are consistent across the board. The turnout here, the PS5 lead, isn't unexpected. Other Capcom games historically using the RE engine, like Devil May Cry 5, showed a similar divide with 120Hz selected, and it seems to just be a trend with the developer's output. This is more of an academic exercise too, just to see what might happen, since rarely do developers give us so much flexibility to experiment. Now clearly the way forward is just to use the framerate mode for 120 FPS, no question, but what this does prove for Monster Hunter Rise is PS5 will offer you that little more GPU headroom to add more visual settings over the top. Overall then, the biggest upgrade for Monster Hunter Rise on PS5, Series X and S is pretty clear. Running at 60 FPS or 120 FPS is a huge upgrade over Switch's 30 FPS. 60 FPS and beyond has a serious, tangible effect on the action, and the hardware is more than up to the task. Equally, there's the loading speeds, which are so rapid on these newer consoles that the fade to black barely takes a second between areas. As for the resolution bump, the 4.8K on PS5 and Series X, and the higher setting toggles, these are all nice extras. They're all eyebrow-raising bullet points, but not an absolute revolution in practice. I think most impressive of all for Capcom's approach to Monster Hunter Rise on consoles is its options menu. It gives players this unusual level of flexibility to customize as they'd like. Now, it's not absolute freedom in the PC tradition, but freedom enough to say, improve the visuals while playing at 120 FPS if there's GPU power going spare. And if it's all too involved, Capcom offers 3 general presets which largely succeed in hitting stable frame rates. As a use of new hardware, adding an advanced menu is something I'd like to see more developers try. Even as an extra, Monster Hunter Rise proves there's no harm in giving the option, just for those that like to experiment. But yes, that's all I've got today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter as always. But from me for now, thanks for watching.